Magic.me is the world's greatest school for magic, meditation, and mysticism, where you can master the lessons of world spirituality and become the master of your reality. I have a new introductory free course up on Magic.me. It's called Why Magic? Start Here, and it is the first thing you will see if you go to the Magic.me site, magick.me. In this class, I describe what magic is, how to start learning it, and most importantly, why you should. Again, it's a free, I think, 25-minute introductory session. It's really awesome. It includes a free meditation if you haven't already got it. There's tons of goodies in there. Check it out. So magic.me, magick.me, and the class is called Why Magic? Start Here. All you have to do is click the free course button, sign up for it, and it's all yours. All right, looking forward to seeing you in class. Our episode today is spicy, very spicy. We are talking to John Zerzan, who is an American anarchist and primitivist eco-philosopher and author. Here's what his Wikipedia bio says about him. Zerzan's work criticizes agricultural civilization as inherently oppressive and advocates drawing upon the ways of life of hunter-gatherers as an inspiration for what a free society should look like. Subjects of his criticism include domestication, language, symbolic thought, such as mathematics and art, and the concept of time. He has a new book out, which came out fairly recently, but since everything is one long moment post-2020, I count it as just out. It's called When We Are Human, Notes from the Age of Pandemics, and it is published by the much-beloved, controversial publisher Feral House, for whom I once worked. Here's the description of the book. These are dark and darkening times, challenging us to look deeper to grasp the roots and dynamics of the looming civilizational crisis. Chronic illness of the planet calls for radically new thinking if there is to be any hope of renewal. When We Are Human offers thought at a necessary and primal level. All previous civilizations have failed, and now there's just one global civilization which is starkly, grandly failing. To deny or avoid this fact is to remain in the sphere of the superficial, the irrelevant. The physical environment is reaching the catastrophe stage as the seas warm, rise, acidify, and fill with plastics. Icebergs ahead and floating past beachgoers idly watching the planet die. So much is failing, so much is interrelated in the technosphere of ever greater dependence and estrangement. Social existence, now strangely isolated, is beset by mass shootings, rising suicide rates, slipping longevity, loneliness, anxiety, and the maddening stream of lies and concocted politics. Zerzan trains his passionate focus on several fields of discourse: anthropology, history, philosophy, technology, psychology, and the spiritual. Points of light that become a kaleidoscope refracting new insights and contributing an overall picture of late civilization. All right, this was an intense interview. Zerzan is an intense dude, and he wrote an intense book. I provide it to you as food for thought. All right, I hope you enjoyed this interview. It is, if nothing else, extremely thought-provoking. All right, here's John Zerzan. So I really, really enjoyed your book. I just finished it. There's so much in there to talk about. I feel like we could do a podcast on every single essay in there. So
it's kind of all over the map.
But everything's great though, and challenging and needed. And so I've done my best to try and touch on the major points. But I just wanted to start off. So for listeners who may not be familiar with your work, I've been aware of your work for I think 20 years. But for listeners who are not familiar with your work, can you just summarize perhaps kind of the anti-civilization?
Well, we're seeing it crumble on a global basis, I would say, and it puts the topic on the table. And if being anti-authoritarian or anarchist means trying to do something about the different forms of domination, of us have come to the conclusion that really stems from domestication, which promptly turns into civilizations and starts us on this road um, to be anti-civilization. Well, for example, let me refer to a very important work, Joseph Tainter's The Collapse of Complex Societies. And he basically says, well, they all tend to reach civilizations, that is, they tend to reach the point past the carrying capacity. The parasite consumes the host. End of story. And it's pretty much a universal story. And now we're getting to the place where it's, to me, it's kind of hard to avoid that conclusion that that's the real problem. And all of these reform gestures and kind of politics as usual have really nothing to do with the crisis at every level in every area. There's no part of it that isn't failing. I mean, it's I don't know where you'd find somebody who resists that conclusion. So it's slowly coming into view, and in the anarchist milieu, I think we've seen a shift from red anarchism to green anarchy, or anarcho-primitivism, or anti-civ anarchy, or whatever you want to call it. It's really the same thing.
How long have you been noticing that shift? Is that in response to the pandemic, or has that been going on longer?
Well, I think it's been going on in a lot of ways. For example, if I've been noticing the decline of postmodernism, which really had its heyday in the 90s, but it's had to me, a very negative influence. If you think that meaning or truth is not stable, it's indeterminate, it's shifting, who's to say what's up? That's just debilitating. And now there's actual there's uh, rejection, uh, explicit rejection of that whole outlook, which really did affect the culture in a big way, I'm afraid. So I think we're getting away from that to be not so afraid of an overview, of a foundationalist approach that doesn't uh, hide from what's needed. What's, for example, origins that was banned by postmodernism. You did not go there. You didn't go. You didn't want to have an overview because the totality, as it was said, is totalitarian,
What do you mean
forbidden. It's a
by
well,
origin?
it's an authoritarian impulse to want to grasp the whole, and that was really aimed at Marxism, in the 70s and 80s, which is valid in that sense. I mean, because I was a Marxist, I'm not now, but that's a healthy response to that. But if you throw out everything else, throw out the baby with the bathwater, and you're just stuck. You don't have any way to see what's going on, as fundamental as that is. There you go. You're pretty much hobbled from the start if you are affected by postmodernism. Of course, that's a very possibly unfair thumbnail version of postmodernism, but I think it gets to the core of it.
It's always seemed to me, yeah, and I want to touch on later trends. Some of these seem to be converging across the political spectrum, but it has always seemed to me that postmodernism really historically has to come out of the post World War II period, because it just seems to me like an immune response to the totalitarian narratives and the tendency towards totalitarian mass narratives of both Marxism and fascism, obviously. But it seems to me
Mm-hmm.
that everyone is now chafing at that, because for the very simple reason, well, there's a lot of reasons, but the reason that I chafe at it is there's just no way to deal with the ecological crisis without some type of totalizing worldview, or overview.
Yeah, agreed.
So why don't I want to take this back? So the thing that has always stayed with me from your work is the you talk so much about the historical moment where people were moved out of agriculture, out of the family units, and into the factories. And you talk a lot about in this book, like I've always remembered, I think it was an essay that you wrote about people attacking clocks in city squares because the imposition of the conquest of time, the imposition of clocked time as a way of keeping people in factories. That's stayed with me since college, actually. I think about that a lot. Um, but you talk a lot about the enclosure in this book and about how critical of a moment this was. And you even talk about it as, part of the ongoing domestication of humans, which I think is a great phrase. And that's really fascinating to me. So I'm wondering if you can talk about what that moment was and kind of why Enclosure was what it was, why it was such a huge deal, and what the war over it was. Because I don't think people have any conception of kind of the history of rebellion against it.
Well, it was a very long-running effort or battle. That's why I wanted to explore it because you hear about that, people losing the commons, the communal sense of the land to various degrees, and how that's extinguished and privatized. It did take an awfully long time. Uh, I learned a lot researching that. Wasn't, I mean, the Industrial Revolution, the factory system came in rather quickly relative to the enclosure movement. That was certainly part of the background to it. This long, sometimes unperceived, but sometimes very acutely felt that people uh, in communities lost that communal aspect uh, on the land. That was,
So,
and
so not to interrupt, but I think just for the audience. So, am I correct that Enclosure is that was the beginning of basically fencing off private land and taking it out of
right,
the private
right.
commons for
In England
individual owners?
specifically,
Okay.
talking about the the story of that in England specifically, and how that was a part of the coming of industrialism.
And
But it was a long, slow deal, and it was accomplished in various means. Finally, it became law. It wasn't originally. It was often more battle with the local landlord, uh, local vested interest, but it eventually became a matter of parliamentary decrees and so forth, which was just all of these things come together to isolate people more and to make it uh, a matter of private property rather than a community-wide culture.
so, what would you say the effect of that was on people's consciousness, if I can use a broad term like that? I mean, it just seems like being torn away from everything which made us human. Well, being torn away from the land in the case of Enclosure, but then being, herded into factories.
Yeah, that's still going on. That's what I see every day. Including mass shootings. When community is gone, and I contend that mass society means there is no community anymore. It's largely a fiction. It's employed by developers or politicians, but where is it? That's why you have all these pathological developments, and it starts well, in the case of the English story with Enclosure, it goes way back. It's a gradual thing, and it's sort of like division of labor, which is, of course, even more basic social institution. It can move slowly, but it really does involve everything. As I think you imply, the whole basis of social existence or culture, it begins to be defined at that level. That's in fact, there was a column today in the New York Times by David Brooks about the mass shootings. Maybe you saw that.
No, I haven't. What?
He basically says these shooters, young male shooters, for the most part, they're not mostly mentally ill. There's no diagnosed mental illness, but what it is isolation. People become indifferent to each other, and they're separated from community. He doesn't actually use the word community, but I think it's just putting in slightly different words. That's what you get, and it's gone. And now we have every kind of horrible development. That's probably the most striking. The mass shootings go on almost every day now. It's,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
unbelievable.
Sometimes multiple
But
times a
nobody's going
day.
to talk about it.
Yeah,
they would talk about it only superficially.
you mentioned in the book, you ask, nobody asked the question of what kind of society would produce this. And I think one of the interesting things about that people are getting about mass shooters also now, I was reading, I believe it was somebody who researches them, a security researcher for the FBI or something like that, was saying, making the really clear point of, look, this is not ideological. People are always coming out and saying, oh, this is white supremacy. There's some ideological drive behind this. Or before that, it was, radical Islamic terror or whatever people were very quick to blame things on. But now she says it's about aesthetics. It's not about ideology. It's about kind of online communities that just aesthetically create this idea of mass shooting for its own sake. Like there's almost kind of a uniform now and a way that these young men approach it. But it's completely nihilistic. But but it's performative, I think, in a social media kind of way, rather than being, there's no manifesto necessarily. There's not an ideological statement, although there are in many cases.
Yeah, in some cases.
So you mentioned the so talking about the moment where people were taken out of the factories, or excuse me, not taken out of the factories, taken out of the home and the from the land and put into factories. One of the things that has been occurring to me during the pandemic is that, to some extent, there's a weird reversal of that process happening right now, and as people have been removed from the office and put back in their homes for however long that lasts. And there's bad things about that, but also I think exciting things about it. But it struck me almost during 2020, during the initial social lockdown. It's like this is almost like a not deindustrialization, but it's certainly it's going to make urban centers much less important, or centralization of labor in offices or factories much less important. It seems. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Interesting point. Yeah. Well, this might be accompanied by a by a rethinking of work, the value of work, the role of work. I mean, there's lots of stuff written about the so-called Great Resignation, and I think even this morning it was another sort of surprise how many people are resisting the workforce. You know, in general, whether it's at home or being, you know, in some cases forced to go back into the office. There may be a rethinking as if this keeps on, if this is not just a passing, maybe a blip of resistance of some kind, but more that people are, you do see some signs of it in terms of what's been written. People reassessing, what am I doing with my life? It's a pretty fundamental question. I spend my whole life working, and what's that about? Against the backdrop of everything going south. I mean, there's no part of it isn't crumbling and scary. So it's, I don't think it's a surprise that people maybe are trying to reassess that too. Something as basic as that.
Yeah, I think that all of the data definitely shows that, certainly with the millennial generation, that meaningfulness of work is way more important than it ever has been for any prior generation, and much more than even finances and things like that. And that it just, like, if there's not a sense of meaningfulness of work, I mean, it's just like what you're saying. It's like, with the backdrop of everything, uh, you know, how can you just go and, make sell cars or something like that?
Uh-huh,
So
uh-huh.
it seems like that reevaluation of work is perhaps long in coming. So one thing that I want to talk about as well is, you talk about the Enlightenment a lot in this book, and not just the Enlightenment being kind of the source of a lot of our woes, but in fact that perhaps we are still in the Enlightenment, and that Faustian, kind of, as Spengler pointed out, that Faustian
Mm-hmm.
imperialist drive to conquer everything and commodify everything is really why we're in this mess. So this was interesting for me, because this is during the Trump period, that became such a talking point on the right. And we had either kind of mainstream conservative pundits coming out of the woodwork to defend and uphold what they perceive to be Enlightenment ideas from, the threat of wokeism or something like that. Or, then you have the more extreme right, as reflected in Steve Bannon and people like that, like the traditionalist or radical Catholic side, where they're coming out with a total critique of the Enlightenment, and they're saying we need to go back to and reject it completely. So I think you touch upon a global backlash against the Enlightenment in the book, but this was just such a massive part of the Trump era, and I think it's suddenly it's so much more pertinent after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, particularly because all of the Supreme Court justices responsible for that were largely put there by Vatican money. And so I think you quote, it's either Marx or Freud in the book. You talk about, you can often learn a lot about civilization's problems from its reactionaries. So I wonder if you've picked up on this anti-Enlightenment or pro-Enlightenment talking point on the right, and if you have thoughts on that.
Not really. I mean, I think I've looked at it as a deeper problem. I mean, you can go back to, speaking of the Enlightenment, to reference Shakespeare's Brave New World. Science and technology is going to create a perfect world. Well, not exactly. It's just really, I think it's fairly easy to see that just is the reverse of what's really going on in terms of, again, isolation and the absence of community. I mean, people, and I mean, for example, the technology thing, that's very, very central to my work. It's going to connect everybody. We're all connected now. Never been so isolated. That's the point of the mass shootings phenomenon, among other things to talk about. But, it's just a series of rather massive lies. Enlightenment. And, the other part, key Enlightenment thing, superstition, intolerance will be gone. Well, sorry about that. That's obviously not happening in the modern world. And I mean, there's a lot to it, but it's easy to see, well, what is the result? We have these claims, these promises, in which now are taken up, to me, not so much by political partisans, but by the technology itself. It makes the claims, it makes the decisions, it decides what's on offer. Because I think, actually, kind of contrary to your questions, it's really more a matter of any political ideology is less important. I think as we go along, it really is to reify the thing totally here, but it's the technology speaking. It's not political voices, as most importantly. I mean, I think you're correct, and that these different players have different parts of this, but, at base, I think it really is, well, the Unabomber was right. As we get more and more technological in society, more and more defined by that, that's the ballgame. That's what, calls the tune.
Yeah, I think, Ted Kaczynski really made that point very clearly. It's just everything's downstream of technology, and I can't really argue with that. I think that's more clear now, certainly, than it was in the early 90s, in the fact that we are all, we've all essentially been driven insane by algorithms. And I don't know if you followed the recent Facebook whistleblower, but one of the things that she said about what's going on inside Facebook is that they're finding that even politicians are, because the algorithm favors further and further polarization, so that people share posts now, they're now seeing politicians in Europe and across the world having to conform to more and more extreme and polarized positions because their constituencies are going that way because they're being pushed by the algorithms. So just to underline your point there, it definitely seems like, even like the people supposedly in running the show are also downstream of these algorithms. And it seems that these companies themselves are downstream of these algorithms, which is obviously I think, really apparent to a lot of people now. Um, I
I
want to
hope
touch.
so. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope so too. And I don't necessarily know what other than basically the point you make, which is an absolute rejection of all of it. I don't know what the answer to that is. But you talk a lot about this kind of like, you call it the Kurzweil delusion in the book. And you talk about this kind of like transhumanism and just the insanity of that. This kind of like teleological view of like, well, the technology will fix it all in the end. And you also point out, the more that technology dominates society, the more fear of death that people have in response to the kind of transhumanist drive for immortality.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really curious. I'm curious about your thoughts. You also you quote Adorno: "The computer is the bankruptcy position of consciousness," which I thought was great. I haven't heard that before, but I'm curious about your thoughts about AI. You mentioned the kind of insanity of people like Ray Kurzweil, Henry Kissinger, Yuval Harari. I think that's how his name is. Yuval Noah Harari, and
Mm-hmm.
even Donna Haraway, which is, I think, a sacred cow for many people. Um,
Oh, yes. The
but
cyborg.
yeah, I actually studied under
Oh,
her, and I took courses from her at UC Santa Cruz. But
oh,
great classes. But I'm curious. Okay, so your thoughts on transhumanism and AI in general, and the religion of that seems to have emerged.
it's not so much in the news lately, and maybe that's because, uh, as extreme as that sounds, it's really been taken up by the mainstream thrust of the technological development. The whole ensemble of it is. Um, I mean, there are differences, that's for sure, but I mean, uh, it's transhumanism is really the logic of the larger movement. Just as I would say that primitivism is the logic of the alternative. That's it. It really comes down to that. I think you're right, though. People are feeling less and less agency all the time. People are getting to be more de-skilled by the movement of technology and AI in particular. Now the metaverse is coming on and it's trying to take over all kinds of capacities and even defining dimensions of life. It's been coming down the road for a while, but now Meta, or Facebook as it used to be called, is trying. It's not clear whether it'll succeed anytime soon, but this whole metaverse project is really the transhumanist thing. I mean, that's just another piece of it, I would say. And but people just feel swept along by it because we are being swept along by it, and it doesn't become a matter of politics. Who's discussing these things? You know, Trump versus Biden or whatever. It never comes up. If that's not respectable, acceptable discourse, is it? I mean, that's who brings that up. So, in the absence of that, of course, people would feel just swept along by the tide. They don't like it. They don't like any institutions. They don't trust them. And but until we get to a deeper level of discourse, what's being put on the table? I mean, nothing much so far. I mean, I see some signs of it. I mean, the fact that I have a weekly radio show, I now have a column with the Eugene Weekly, the sort of alternative countywide. Pretty much every small city or big city has that. That's a nice change. I'm still sort of pinching myself that they want me to write a column for that. Very liberal. This is a white liberal college town. Exactly the metaphor, like a minor Austin, one might say. I don't know, but that's not part of the deal. That's not part of liberals. Don't talk about that.
So you see a
You know,
shift in that regard. I mean, it definitely
but
seems that people are.
speaking of, you mentioned.
Uh huh.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, it definitely seems to me that people are just flailing around looking for any angle or life preserver they can get, which is
Yeah.
why I think a lot of these um, yeah, I think everyone would have to agree that the kind of liberal consensus is collapsing. So,
That's you mentioned the right in passing, or maybe not in passing, but I've been attacked times from from the left for using Heidegger or even Spengler, or uh, people on the right. I'm not on the right, but if you can't even use the insights of people outside of the dominant paradigm, well, where are we then? I mean, I think the critique that Heidegger raised, of course, he was a Nazi, he became a Nazi. That's incredibly absurd. But his comments on technology were, and he sort of tried to take it back later, but very radical, very very key.
absolutely. I want to come back to Spengler in particular in a second, but I just wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
It is the. I hope it is clear. Like I think of the kind of well-meaning middle class bourgeois liberal consensus is so personified to me by, for instance, the opinion section of the Guardian in the UK, and it has just become so obvious that it has nothing to offer. And you mentioned, I think, a good. I don't want to. I don't know him and I don't know his work very well, so this is not like a call out. But you mentioned Paul Kingsnorth in this book, and this is just a kind of such an example of this approach to me of people who are, flirting with various ideas, pushing. He was pushing Dark Mountain. He was pushing the idea of ecology, but then just gives up and goes and converts to the Orthodox Church. And for him, it's just kind of. It just seems. I don't know. Maybe there's not a lot of skin in the game. Perhaps this is just like another thing to write an opinion column about. I don't know. It's just, it seemed to me, what's the best way to put it? That approach, when I see that approach from people, it's almost like watching like a cooking show where people are running around sampling different cuisines and, commenting on them. And it's like, it seems like the position of this role in society is to determine what is good manners for the middle class. And it's just useless. So
Well, yeah, there's a lot of surrender. There are various cases of that. Look, don't be stupid. It's all over. There's nothing you can do about it, and you're a clown if you think otherwise. If you want to hold open the door for possibility somewhere along the line, well, that's just ridiculous. It can be very vociferous. You could, if you hold out any hope uh, anywhere down the line, even conceivably, people react. I don't think Kingsnorth has done that, but it's a clear case of wow, just well, the existential thing. What's the difference between collecting stamps or joining the resistance? It's all just a matter of personal choice. Pick a number, pick whatever you want. But yeah, that's the surrender that. I mean, there's a reason for that kind of nihilism or arbitrary. It doesn't make any difference what you do. He's not being nasty about it, but
no.
I think it's a very sad turn.
Well, I'm wondering if I want to clarify this point. If so, for the audience, Paul Kingsnorth is a writer in England and ran something called the Dark Mountain Initiative in the UK, which got a lot of traction for a while. And I believe my understanding, and again, I don't know his work very well, is that he came to the position that there is nothing we can do to turn around the environmental crisis. We're all screwed, and sustainability is a joke. And then he just became a reactionary Christian. Oh, that okay, nice. Um, I'm curious how you clearly distinguish your position from that, because it seems that you are also coming at this from the angle of there's not really any way of salvaging technological civilization, and that you're coming at it from the primitivist critique. So how would you differentiate your rejection of the progress, perhaps, let's say? How would you differentiate your rejection of that versus his?
Well, I haven't surrendered at all. I mean, it's that's. that's not a choice to me. You've got to try to do something about it. And if you think the response, the Luddite response, the anti-Civ response is unthinkable or not, it's not going to happen. It's just simply not going to happen. Well, um, some of us hold out hope that it can happen. It must happen. If there isn't as I say, somehow primitive future, there won't be a future. So what choice do we have? And as the dominant order shows itself to be more and more in tatters and just a place of well, dis-ease. I mean, the whole thing has failed just in a spectacular way, and now it's one global system, one civilization based on capital and technology, and really nothing outside of it. Well, then it's all got to go, and that's serious. That's just to me an unavoidable conclusion. So you do what you can to make that happen, to have the soft landing. I mean, we're often accused. Well, Chomsky, for example, says we're genocidists, not only genocidal, but we want billions of people to die. Well, that's craziness. He's either really stupid, and he has been for a long time, but it's also just very, very dishonest. Nobody I know is talking about, in effect, pulling the plug so that everybody will die. We're talking about a soft landing, if you will. We've got to reverse this process. We've got to go in a healthy direction that reclaims community, that respects the earth, that pays attention to the indigenous dimension, all these different things, none of which amount to surrender. But he's sticking to the left. He's just sticking
Yeah.
to the corpse of the left, no matter how it's failed so so immensely.
Yeah, it seems like that's its job. In many ways, like it works. It's not a bug; it's a feature. Um, yeah, that I think is a really interesting or a really critical point to make, where you always hear that critique. I always hear it from the Fox News conservatives, but I suppose also from left liberals, the idea of, oh, you're talking about, he's saying that people who are interested in ecology or green anarchism or going back to nature want to genocide billions of people, which is that's what you're saying, right? And you're saying that's
Yeah,
cartoonish.
yeah,
Yeah, and I can't think of, the only example I could think of that would be like somebody like Pentti Linkola in Finland, who's a fascist. He's a reactionary fascist, I believe. So, and well, he's now dead. But other than that, I don't see that, and so I think that's a really important. That's important to underline because, it's kind of like when people. Well, I don't know. I just think that it's important to point that critique out and that it is wrong.
yeah.
So,
It's a choice. What if you want people talking about the value of work in their lives, what they're spending their time on Earth at? Well, I mean, to me, it's the reverse of quiescence. I mean, it's the most exciting thing you can do. It's just you know possibly uh, end up in defeat, but I think it's a thrilling thing to do, to tackle that. To speak out against the denial that so much rules the conversation in society. It's got to change, and it can change. I think if it somehow we are able to see uh, a discourse that puts serious questions on the table, basic questions as to what's driving all this, what's causing this. It's then we might get somewhere.
so you mentioned the idea of a global civilization, and I really want to touch on that. So this is where I want to segue back to Spengler. So you talk a lot about Oswald Spengler, and that was interesting to me. And I particularly love the idea of, you mentioned that you see him as applying Goethe's plant morphology to civilizations, which was cool. But he is, as far as I understand, the source of the idea that it's the death of Western civilization, and that civilizations have natural life cycles, and that this one is currently
Right.
coming to an end. And you hear that a lot now. That's become pretty common currency, and I don't think people have any understanding of where that came from. Um, it was picked up by Pat Buchanan in the 90s. He wrote The Death of the West
Oh,
after Spengler, and then that became Donald Trump's Make America Great Again. He just templated his political platform from that. So it's interesting. There's a direct line to Trump. But you hear this a lot. You hear this from, kind of ridiculous people like Jordan Peterson, even. And so people mention this quite a lot. But one thing that you point out in this book that I actually hadn't fully considered before is the idea that it's not like this death of, quote, death of Western civilization. It's that we're in a global civilization and that this is perhaps the last civilization. Maybe this is all we have. And you actually call it a single global domestication machine at one point. And you basically say there is nowhere else to go. So, we hear a lot about this idea that, China's taking over. It's going to be the next empire, which frankly, I have my doubts about. But if instead I think we can kind of consider the world as one civilization that is in the process of failure, that just undercuts so much of this. We've seen this resurgence of nationalism, and I just see it as, people trying to push each other out of a sinking boat in the hope that their group will somehow make it out.
Yeah.
And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And, and to touch on something I mentioned before, we've seen the right also adopting a lot of the language of the anti-globalization movement, but then proposing nationalism or even ethno-nationalism as a response to it, which is, also ridiculous. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this idea that instead of this kind of petty nationalism, we are in, or even I think the mainstream left liberal idea that, America is going to be replaced by a Chinese empire or something like that. That instead
there
we're...
are different flavors. I mean, different cultures, but there's one overarching civilization where domestication rules everywhere. I remember the ads Coca-Cola used to run. They would show somebody on the steps of Asia with a can of Coke, and you could already see, decades ago already, how as Pico Iyer, for example, wrote about that, everything gets sort of homogenized despite the political differences and so forth. Um, People wear the same clothes, the airports are identical everywhere on the planet, and so on and so on. As more and more the architecture is the same, and so forth. But there's something underlying that. And there are important differences, there are important issues, and so on. But I mean, I don't see how you can resist that, main picture that this is the thing, and this is the Titanic, and we can jockey the deck chairs around, but look where it's going, faster and faster too. And I'm not really a doomsayer, but man, it's just scary. I mean, yeah. And then people do flail around, and what alternatives are they given? You can spend all your time hating Trump or whatever. That's and I hate Trump, of course, but I mean,
Yeah.
but where does that get you? I mean, now we have the sideshow of these hearings about January 6th. There's a certain obsession with that, and I'm not saying it has no importance whatsoever, but meanwhile, all of these fundamental things are just showing us unmistakably how dire it all is, and how connected it all is. There's no part of it. I don't know if this has anything to do with your question there, but a year before the person who did the Sandy Hook shootings, Adam Lanza, he called my radio show.
Jesus.
My cousin and I were co-hosting that night, and he was talking about a chimpanzee that attacked its owner, also in Connecticut where he lived, and the savage attack. And he said, "We're like that chimp. We're leading these unnatural lives." I mean, the chimp was being fed human food and was dressed as a human, and it flipped out. Anyway, he said, "That's where we're at. We're like the chimp. This is crazy." And he sounded like a very sensitive high school kid, and we both thanked him for the call. Hey, that sounds like you got it, man. And we went on. It wasn't there wasn't much conversation, and we were not arguing with each other. Then a year later, he kills 2 dozen people, children, and so forth. And then a year after that, it came out that that was who called, and it became a big media thing for about a day. It was just nonstop nonsense. And the question was, every time the question was, how did that make you feel to realize that that was Adam Lanza on your phone, on your show? That was it. All day. That was the media. That was the dominant thing. And I kept saying, what does that have to do with anything? Who cares what I felt about it? I mean, the real question is, was that valid? Are we not in that position? I'm not sure as hell not upholding that mass murder that he did a year later, but come on. Why be so trivial? This People magazine level of discourse. I mean, it's incredibly. How can you actually, Don Lemon on CNN, I think it is, he was the only one who entertained that question a little bit, and a little bit off air even more. But I mean, he was the only one who wasn't terrified against asking something basic about that. Isn't that, after all, time to just take a look at things? And now it's even worse.
And what
Since
was
then,
your
now it's all
answer?
the time.
What was your answer?
Well, then I don't want to talk about how I felt. What the fuck? Nobody knows who I am. Nobody cares who I am. Why not talk about the essentials? What the hell is going on with social existence? How have we gotten this far? And of course, now it's worse. It was still not doing it very much. It's just not much allowed. And that's tragic. But I think it can change. And I think I see more people who are, uh, posing these same questions. I think there's a little bit of an anarchist revival or renewal going on right now. It's too early to tell, but there is some signs of that. Like, what happened 20 years ago with anti-globalization movement, which
Mm-hmm.
doesn't, which wasn't much anti-globalization, by the way, but now maybe there can be something like that that does have some depth, that does have some teeth. Back then, for example, the reporters at these big summit demos, back in starting Seattle and all the others, 1999 to 2000, and then 9/11 put the end to it. But they always would ask the protester, "So why are you against globalization?" And the answer was almost uniformly, "We're not against globalization, but we want a nice, kind, bottom-up kind of warm and fuzzy globalization. That's not anti-globalization. That's, you want some reform that ain't going to happen. That's about it. That's missing the point. Anyway, it can be something much more serious the next round, and we'll find out.
It
Sorry
seems
to go
like,
off on a tangent there.
yeah, the thing with Adam Lanza is I can, it's hard for me to think of a more heartbreaking example other than what just happened in Texas. And events like that, I know people who were first responders to that. And that town, from what I have heard, has never recovered. It's just you just don't recover from something like that. And so I'm very cautious about, you know, no pun intended, globalizing things like that in the sense of oh, what does this mean about us? What does this mean about society? Because I think that somehow betrays the gravity of the actual action, and it's hard for me to even think or talk about that event. But unfortunately, the problem now
Yeah.
is that we have that event almost every day now. So, and that was already in process of happening when the Sandy Hook shooting occurred. And
Yeah.
so the debate is obviously about gun control. Yesterday, Shinzo Abe was assassinated by somebody with a homemade gun. So, it's not necessarily that, but that becomes a talking point. That becomes something to hang the rage and despair and sense of futility and trappedness on, and I think that's understandable. But if we are to ask if we're to ask a broader question, which is not about one individual person, but why are these school shootings happening all the time? I don't know
Yeah,
what
and
your thoughts are on that, but
well, I don't see how that's going to be reversed. Everything is the grounds for that kind of hyper alienation, horrific stuff. That's not the only part of it, but and by the way, it's spreading. The mass shootings. The Abe shooting wasn't a mass shooting, but what was the other one the other day? Just the other day, I can't think of it now. But it's not just. It's a typically American thing. Let's face it. But it's. I see it over the recent years. It's starting to spread to other places.
yeah, definitely. The obvious ones are Breivik and the New Zealand shooter, but so it seems to be a global thing, and it seems to be less. I mean, it is very ideological in some cases, but otherwise, it just seems to be just eruptions of insanity. And one of the things that I've been asking, maybe we can even ask this about the world, but one of the things I've been asking about America specifically is at what point do we have to gather all of this violence together and say that it is an ongoing conflict instead of isolated incidents? We have, even The Guardian a few days ago was saying, it's not a question of if America goes into civil war, it's a question of when, which is rather irresponsible of them. I don't like The Guardian. But, it's kind of like, I was looking a few years ago at things like the Troubles in Ireland, and we think of that as a broad scale conflict, but it's like even like the there's so much more gun violence in America that it's like the Troubles over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
So my question is, at what point do we maybe put all this together and say it is a guerrilla civil war? And what are the sides? Are there sides? Is it just is it a not necessarily a civil war, but a civil suicide?
I think it's more the latter, and it's not surprising that the liberals are inflating this January 6th thing, for example. They keep talking about democracy hanging by a thread, and next time it'll be even worse. And well, I mean, it wasn't nothing, but it took months to organize that. It took millions of dollars to get these yahoos to do that, to go up to Capitol buildings. But I mean, after all, what if they had? Let's look at it this way: what if they had succeeded? What if they had succeeded in blocking the official, swearing in of Biden or something? You know what? Pretty much nothing. All the institutions of society are still there. Nothing's gonna. I mean, what are they dreaming about? Do they have no notion at all about how society works? For example, is the military going to do nothing?
Right.
I mean, that's just these people. In my opinion, they represent quite a. There's a level of resentment in this country, which is the key thing about the Trumpism thing. But yeah, that's nothing real new. But to make this such a big crisis, we're definitely heading into civil war. I don't see that. I just don't see that. The problems are way deeper than this right versus, and there's the Antifa faction in the anarchist thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
They like to, up in Portland, for example, for a year or two, almost every night, it just went on and on and on.
Right.
And they love to rumble against the right wing, these pitiful knotheads, and go to town. And on my radio show, I say more than once, I got a baseball bat. I'll loan it to you, man. I got no problem with that. No problem at all. But if that's the limit of your perspective, really, you're just another liberal. I mean, that's the only thing to worry about.
That's an interesting point. It's just like just on the spectrum of Trump derangement syndrome. It's just like taking that one step further. I haven't thought about that. That's really interesting. Well, Yeah.
I mean, I could be wrong. I could be just, poo-pooing the whole thing, and it may be a little more serious than that. But I don't know if it is.
With January 6th. Yeah, I
Yeah.
haven't been following it that closely, but my perception, it's like, was there really any time at which, you know, the military could not have just been brought in to stop it? I mean, what are we really talking about here? Like, that's like, I've referred to it as, the comment section showing up, like overflowing into reality. It's just like a few, like, I think there were organized people in there, but it's like, what, like a guy dressed like a Viking, like furries? It's just like ridiculous. But of course, framing it in that way, in many ways, even when I was watching it, it occurred to me, like, in a way, like, this is the best thing that could have happened to the Biden administration. It allows them to, say, well, look, there's the other side. It legitimizes them. It allows them to completely wipe the slate with Trumpism and make a break with it. It shows that they're the responsible adults. So I think it was a gift to them in many ways. So, and
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, again, I don't know. I've been following it that closely, but I really doubt that ever was that much more than just like a rowdy tour group. So, okay, one thing that I definitely want to talk about and touch on is spirituality, because this we talk a lot about alternative approaches to spirituality on this podcast. It's kind of the topic of it. And you have a lot of thoughts about this. So the first thing that I'm really interested in is you talk about ecological anarchism's kind of flirtations with various spiritual paths in the 70s, and how maybe outside of Taoism or Zen Buddhism, you felt they mostly missed the mark. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about that. And I think you basically just come out and say, if I'm paraphrasing you correctly, that spiritual abstraction is basically part of the problem, and that nihilism and the kind of the whole spook of sustainability are part of the problem, and that any ecological approach to spirituality has to be rooted in total, direct, immanent perception of the world, which I couldn't agree with more. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that as a whole.
Well, I think it's been a nice development in some ways. It's a very elusive term. Certainly, spirituality. What does that mean? But I think among anarchists, there used to be a real aversion, more of a 19th century materialist. I think of it as kind of a wooden, knee-jerk atheism. I'm not a theist, by the way, but you just didn't. The spiritual thing just never entered the picture. And now I've found, to my surprise, that some of the most militant, ready to rumble black bloc friends of mine, deeply spiritual.
Hmm.
And now it's okay to kind of bring that out. And there's all kinds of sources of certainly the indigenous perspective in a lot of ways, both anthropologically, or that is prehistory wise, and present day wise. Thoreau. I mean, there's all sorts of sources, and I keep coming back to this was some years ago, at least 10 years ago. I was in Turkey, and at the end of the talk, there was a discussion period, and a young woman said, I think at base, this green anarchy, this primitivist thing, is a spiritual movement. And I was just, what? Come again? And I really wanted to know what she meant by that, what that meant to her. But she had to catch a bus to get to her home, and I didn't get to talk to her, only for a minute. But I've been thinking about that ever since. I mean, she put it right on the table. And actually, I do think there's a very, and the postmodernists, people I know, attack this vehemently. And the perspective I'm thinking about is that what we're talking about is intimacy with the natural world, a direct connection, um, a wholeness that's only present before, as really as Rousseau said, before you get all these institutions that corrupt people and splinter them, uh, which postmodernism seemed to celebrate, actually. that's you could say that's a spiritual place. That's a spiritual goal. That's what it's about, in its most basic terms, in terms of what kind of world do you want? What kind of existence is desirous, or at least conceivably possible, or once obtained? And that's been a big part of my uh, odyssey, if you will, my chance discovery of anthropology in the 80s. I was more of a Frankfurt School character, influenced by the Situationists as well, quite a lot. And I just bumped into the literature. Um, Solons, Richard B. Lee, all these people that just gave a whole new paradigm of what prehistory was like, was what human species were like before domestication. It just really did blow my mind. It was such a radical thing. It just put me on a different. I mean, I was somewhat in that direction from dialectic of enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer, for example, and even Freud, civilization and its discontents, stuff like that. But this really did, for me, provide a sort of foundation for it. People did live that way,
So can you
without.
touch on that? Can you maybe summarize that for people who are not aware of what was the worldview that you gleaned when you were reading this anthropological stuff? Of what was life like prior to
Yeah,
industrialization?
and you don't want to romanticize it, and you also have to realize that we don't have the full evidence. We don't know what consciousness was like. We don't even know what it's like now in a lot of ways. But you know, before hierarchy, before destroying the planet, before slavery, and all these things that now are just come with civilization, and people depend upon them. People are ruled by them. All the patriarchy right on up. It's just of a piece, and there you have it. And there you see time after time they collapse. The civilizations run their course. You don't have to be a Spenglerite to see that, but and you begin to wonder, why is that? Is there a different way? And 99% of our time as a human species, or various human species, was outside of domestication. We took what nature gave, and with domestication, you engineer nature, you dominate nature, you take over, and I mean, that's just the clear path. There it is. And the only objection, the fundamental objection is, okay, that's all true. That's fine and dandy and everything, but so what? You might as well, as somebody in Greece, I remember saying, you might as well argue against the sun coming up. You can't do nothing about that. Well, what if you can? Maybe we should try. It did. It really was a pretty workable, when we lived in band society, when we had face-to-face community, which I would argue is the only actual community.
Yeah.
It isn't community anymore if you can't be in direct, you know, communion with people in these small scale. That was what society was: small scale, decentralized. That's what I'd like to see: a radically decentralized world where people could go back to having community, having some agency over their lives and the world, and until it was messed up. That's very, very recent, really, in terms of, first human species 3 million years ago. Domestication is only about 10,000 years old.
Hmm.
That's a blink of an eye. So, you begin to suggest in somewhat more practical terms, this isn't just some nutty anarchist dreaming up stuff. There's an actual prehistory that you can look at. And
Am I picking up correctly that you use the word domestication interchangeably with civilization? That you replaced one with the other?
well, pretty much,
That's
pretty
great.
much, you can't have civilization without it. And if I could just stick this in there for a second,
Mm-hmm.
this just happened in Dublin. Every other year, there's an international gathering of scholars. It's called CHAGS, which stands for Conference on Hunter-Gatherer Studies. And a friend of mine was there and gave 2 papers, actually. And I'm having him on the radio show in 2 weeks. He said the most incredible thing happens. they used to be people like Marshall Salins. Sometimes they get these questions. You sound like these primitivist anarchists. Are you an anarchist? And they're academics. They don't. Oh no, I'm a professor. They didn't really want to go there. Well, apparently, that's kind of changed. My friend James gave a very upfront radical primitivist point of view. He's also, he knows his stuff. He knows the literature. He knows the evidence and so on. But and Richard B. Lee, who's the dean of all that, he's this sort of legend in the field of anthropology, as you may know, just got up and applauded.
Interesting.
This is what we need. This is what we got to have. It's time to pull together here. We're not just academics. I mean, I don't have the details, but he said it was really astounding. So maybe something is starting to happen.
Interesting. And I would imagine that the pandemic has perhaps accelerated that.
Could be, yeah.
So I also, in terms of spirituality, also the flip side of that, I definitely want to get in here. You talk about the decadent period in Victorian England and the kind of mass obsession that people had with drugs and with the occult, and ultimately even with psychoanalysis. And you talk of these, you basically say these are escape hatches from the pressures of industrialization. It's just a dodge. And that I want to touch on. I mean, we talk a lot about esotericism on this podcast, but even I can't deny that, like, in a sense, it's kind of a measuring stick of the progress of alienation. It's like it's a side effect of industrialization, of people trying to escape to something else. And I think you're quoting somebody in the book. I can't remember who you're quoting, or it's you said it, that as the individual, maybe you said it, as the individual is diminished in civilization, religion advances in inverse proportion. And you also say that, like, even art is just a consolation prize for the loss of the natural world, and that philosophy is anti-life and is a process of disassociation from the body. And I frankly, I can't really disagree with any of that. But it was pretty clear to me that you were talking about the modern period actually by way of talking about the decadent period in England. And so I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious what your thoughts about the parallels there, what you see happening now, and just the kind of talking about this idea of people using escape routes to just avoid their own alienation, to avoid the severity of the situation, because that's really important.
Well, as you say, the industrial cancer had conquered everything. And if you look at the radical history, you don't find much opposition. William Morris stood out as a radical. His News from Nowhere is one of my favorite books, imagining a utopian future where industrialism goes away. But there wasn't very much of that, unfortunately, for the anarchist tradition to make use of. I think that as you put it well, you do have these side routes. What's on offer? I mean, what else are you going to do? I mean, that's you know that was actually totally in the saddle by then, by the end of the century, especially in England where it started. I mean, the whole industrial thing, and so that's where it's at today too. I mean, it doesn't look good. I'm not trying to, certainly not depicting a rosy present, but so it's not surprising. And of course, conspiracy theory
Hmm.
jumps out as one of the most remarkable, crazy deals. The most preposterous stuff. I mean, and that isn't anything new, but you can see now as things get worse, you can see the crazier responses. Um, and that takes all forms. As civilization is a gigantic force field that I think affects everything. It
Hmm.
affects each of us. The toll on friendships, the toll in every way. It's just, um, and I've had a falling out about vaccines. I don't know what you think about that stuff, but I was just very surprised at the ferocious attacks I was getting 2 years ago, or when the pandemic started, because I wasn't anti-vax. You know, I have
Oh,
a
because
problem with
you weren't
lots.
anti-vax. That's interesting.
No, I have a problem with lots and lots of people suffering and dying. I mean,
Who are you getting attacked by over that?
other anarchists, other green anarchists.
Huh.
That's wouldn't have been too surprised at various people,
That's
fringe people, or
surprising.
what. Yeah, it was very shocking to me. Very, you know, and the point of view. Um, I'd been in Italy not too long ago, and a close friend of mine just really just erupted. What kind of anarchist are you? You're a turncoat. You're a traitor. Um, in other words, seeing these vaccines as a way to, it really is conspiracy thinking motif. It's just a plot to control people. I mean, I have lot of trouble seeing that. I mean, yeah, I mean, big pharma. Okay, I've I know something about that. I don't trust that stuff fully in any respect. But you know, uh, it just seemed a little far fetched, and just the vehemence of you know just nasty personal attacks over that. I just was taken aback, and that's died down. I don't know. Maybe some of those people have changed their minds. I don't know. I'm not
That's
even in touch
interesting.
with
I did
them
see that
anymore.
Paul Kingsnorth came out and became an anti-vaxxer, and I was looking at he's very against it, and I was looking at the comments on articles about it, and people were, the level of vitriol on that issue. I mean, people were, I
Yeah,
think there were basically like one or two people that showed up. Basically, people were agreeing with them, and there were like one or two people showing up in the comments making reasoned arguments about it's like, look, this is the right thing to do, and people were just mobbing them, and
yeah,
it's like rage mob against people who are pro-vaccine, which is bizarre because it's the opposite side in quote unquote the mainstream world. It's the opposite. Anti-vaxxers are so violently attacked. So that's really interesting to me that you were seeing it from the other end. I am not conspiratorial about it. I am not, I suppose, an anti-vaxxer. Although you have to, it's hard to get away from the fact that there is an angle of it, not a conspiratorial angle, but there is just a symbolic level to it of just being colonized in a sense because of the nature of the mRNA vaccine. It's like your genetics are being colonized by corporations, and that is outside of the science of it, I think. But there is an angle of it that is uncomfortable, and that's essentially how I feel about it. So
uh-huh. Yeah. But it's hard to have a reasoned discussion when it starts out as just this vicious attack, and I mean, there's all kinds of uh, levels of that. I ran into a woman I only know slightly at the post office, and uh, anyway, make a long story short, she said no one has died from COVID, and I just thought, man,
okay,
I'm not saying that all these
okay,
people would agree with that, but
that's okay.
I just walked away like you got shit for brains. You
Yeah,
what the fuck are you
That
talking
that
about?
that is that is ridiculous. I actually just looked at the COVID dashboard yesterday, and I think the global death toll that we know of is now up to 6.5 million people, and that's precluding like over 100,000. I think it's a lot more than that. It is an unbelievable number who have had it, and as we now know about long COVID, and I don't know if you've interacted with people who clearly have long COVID. It's scary. Like, we're not just
Yes,
talking about dying; we're talking about permanent neurological damage or lung damage or heart damage, and it's just, yeah, but oh,
oh yeah,
I guess no one's died of it. We should just pretend it's not happening. Well, that in its own
yeah,
way is a flight into a fantasy world, and I think that I don't want to totally conflate that with Trumpism, and I think that people make that mistake because this is people have many different takes on this from different political sides. Obviously, Paul Kingsnorth is an example, but um, Trumpism itself just represents a flight into fantasy. It's just choosing to live in a fantasy world, and rather than face the reality of global warming or industrial collapse or the inherent uh, uh, just the inherent unworkableness of so much right now. But I would imagine that flight into fantasy has really been encouraged by lockdown and the pandemic, because it is, and I have to check this tendency in myself as well. It is so easy to, when we are completely taken out of community, as you mentioned, to end up thinking things that aren't true and exaggerating things and working yourself into a worldview that it has no bearing even potentially on the real world. And so that's really scary for society. And in a lot of ways, I think that, this is obviously a metaphorical statement. It is not a medical statement, but in a lot of ways, the social distancing and COVID phenomenon is a exaggerated symptomology of what was happening already. Now, I'm not saying that it's not a disease, obviously, but just in the sense that the general trend of society has been isolation. And prior to COVID, everyone was already socially isolated they were just on their phones in their own reality, chasing their own algorithmic tunnel. And COVID is like the ultra acceleration of that. And it is the acceleration away from what you were talking about, which is people just being in normal face-to-face community, without which I think we just are insane. We're lost. So I'm,
Well put.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was coming. It was already developing that way for sure.
Yeah, and there's a level of it too where, in the quote unquote first world, we are even people who are facing COVID, we're sheltered so much from the reality of it, the economic knock-on effects, I mean, you mentioned, even at the beginning of the pandemic, people are afraid of running out of toilet paper. Well, it's like, this is how most people in the world live. It's like toilet paper is such a bizarre thing in a way in the grand scheme
Yeah.
of things. And you also mentioned, like, if everyone used it, well, global deforestation would be complete. So, you know, um, I don't know. I feel like some people hoped maybe that even at the beginning of the shutdown that maybe it would give the environment a little bit of a break. At the time, I lived in Los Angeles and the air had never been cleaner. But then
Yeah.
then it came back and it was worse than ever before. And I don't know. I assume it's probably the same, and I don't know why that is. Maybe people are just cutting corners now, but um, it has not slowed down environmental degradation, and it has accelerated, global mental health, the global mental health crisis, certainly the mental health crisis in America, to, I think, in ways that we don't even understand. And we may not for a long time. I mean, school shootings is obviously was happening before, but it's that's a symptomology of that type of isolation, and I don't think it's, it was already accelerating before. I don't know if I would necessarily want to conflate those things, but um, I guess, well, why don't we why don't we let's just wrap this up. Why don't we wrap this up by just asking what comes next? I mean, it's hard to see, frankly, hopeful futures right now. So, what comes, where are we? What comes next? What are things to think about as, potential solutions?
Well, I've seen here, maybe this doesn't count for much, but some return of public gatherings. We put on a thing for a new anarchist book, had a very nice turnout and a very robust discussion afterwards at a local tavern, the sort of the main hangout in the Whitaker neighborhood here in Eugene, which was the sort of center of the anarchist upsurge 20 years ago. Seeing a few more signs like that, uh, and it's been a while, not just COVID stopping it, but nothing much in the past 20 years. But, uh, when you look back, I think the Unabomber case was interesting to me, instructive to see how many kids really already knew that stuff. That was very nice. It was a nice surprise to get that from, well, especially the more punk, you know, already oppositional culture kind of stuff. But um, fairly widespread. And then when the anti-globalization thing, there was a lot of energy there. There was a lot of strong radical energy, and I think maybe we're due for something like that again. One swallow doesn't make the summer, as they say, but it's we're in a desperate place, and I think more people want to have actual physical encounters with each other. Now it's a little more possible. It's not quite so scary a thing, COVID wise, but maybe we're going to be seeing more, and we need much more, as I've argued, and I think you agree. It's because it's not just the mass shootings. That's easy to peg on because it really is awful. But opioid overdose deaths,
Yeah.
how suicide is among the young. I mean, these
Yeah.
things are just part of the how bad things are getting and how fast they're getting even worse. So I think people want something different and a chance to get together and try to see what we can come up with. What do do others have the same questions and fears and so forth? We can start to maybe challenge it.
Hmm. Yeah, I was a senior in high school during the WTO protests, and that was so exciting at the time. And um, you never hear anyone talk about it anymore. It's like, and one of the things you mentioned in the book is that I thought was interesting, and I hadn't considered it before, was distinguishing that from Occupy and why they were different. And maybe if you want to touch on that, just as a last bit, I think that's important to understand.
Yeah, that was maybe a sort of aftershock. Occupy around 2012, right? It really it wasn't much. I don't really know any anarchists who were involved. Frankly, they hoped it would be interesting, but it really wasn't much. It just really had, for one thing, it had pretty much no analysis. David Graeber,
Yeah.
and his book is horrible. Dawn of Everything is just, we could get into that, but anyway, yeah, Occupy just, at a certain point, at the most militant site of Occupy, which was Oakland, Occupy Oakland, there was actually a vote taken as to whether, I forget precisely how it was phrased, but what is the legacy? What is the uh, kind of foundation of what we're all about? Is it the left, or is it the indigenous, the
Huh.
ancestral, that sort of stuff? And the vote was the left. We,
As
oh
always.
man,
Yeah.
and that was partly it went that way because there was a very authoritarian bunch who had claimed the native thing. They owned it, and they were kind of not very popular. So that probably turned some votes against them, which missed the point. It wasn't about any this or that group. It was much deeper than that, and they blew it. And they blocked the port for a day, and there was quite a lot of stuff going on, but it was quite weak. It just didn't have much going, and like I said, there weren't any anarchists involved, really. I don't think. Of course, people would say, "Well, who are you to define who's an anarchist?" And, okay, I get it, but I don't think there was much radical stuff going on there at all.
Yeah, I unfortunately have to agree. I was involved in Occupy, and I was camped out for 2 weeks at City Hall in Los Angeles. But it was kind of a whole lot of nothing, unfortunately, in the sense it was fun, it was exciting, it was a great outburst of energy, which I was inspired by for years. But I mean, essentially, it was people could not get a cohesive platform. They could not agree on anyone. That's when the kind of privilege checking and you can't talk really started. There was a lot of just people shutting each other down and which at times suspect it may have had something to do with COINTELPRO. But or maybe not. It's just maybe that's just how people are. But it basically nobody could come to a cohesive platform, and then it just turned into people shooting up in the mud.
Well,
So
we-
you know, you
well,
might.
it was also has to do with democracy. Speaking of Seattle, WTO, they had all these spokes councils and, consensus sort of effort like Occupy in a lot of ways. We weren't even allowed to take part in that.
Oh, why is that?
Use for that. You know, a different perspective is autonomy. People do what they want. You do this. Maybe I don't want to do that. I'll do this, and fine. You don't have to have a mass vote about it. That's just ridiculous, and that's why we were just. They didn't want to hear us. They didn't want to let us even be part of their democracy, and it never even occurred to them that what kind of model is that? Isn't this thing stronger when people have agency, have choice? They can do what they want. And there were struggles, of course, in Seattle. The sort of peace police didn't want the anarchists from Eugene, so-called, to trash downtown. The point of view though is you want to be with your peace sign or whatever, fine, but maybe we'll be doing something different. I don't know who that would be, but you know what I mean. It's how about that as the model? Nobody's going to agree 100% on everything. Why should they?
Yeah.
Totally different approach.
Yeah, it's hard not to see that these days. I mean, it's like there's a certain level where democracy is choosing your master, which is it's just like a non-starter to begin with, but is also it's like which person would you like to lead you to the slaughter? But is also it's consent to rule by the least apt. It's just like because it's by nature the biggest number of people voting win, and the more people they are, the dumber they're going to be. Unfortunately, that's just the nature of humanity.
And then you put them on the spot, and I can recall occasions like that. Taking a little problem with that. So you're in love with mass society, huh? You like that? Well, you are. Why not cop to it? I hate it. It's the wrong way to live, and you're defending it. That's why we're at odds here. One of the reasons.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like I'm talking about fighting with leftist anarchists, red anarchists or any other version of leftist anarchists. They're fine with it. Chomsky wants more development. He wants more mass society. What on earth are you thinking?
Yeah, I remember seeing a clip with him interviewed, and again, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I remember somebody was interviewing him about the pandemic, and he was saying, forgive me if I get this wrong, because I don't have it right in front of me, but he was basically saying that anyone who does not get vaccinated should be locked out of society and starved. And it's just like Noam Chomsky, like wait, what? Like what? Like how do you get to this position? And I understand it's just, but I mean, like that is in a sense the mainstream Democratic Party position. It has been. It's like, so yeah, to that point. All right. Well, this was a really good conversation. I really enjoyed it. Where can people find out more about you, and also tell people about your new book and where they can get it?
Oh, thanks, Jason. Well, it's called When We Are Human from Feral House. It's somewhat widely available. I think it's done fairly okay. I don't really know, and I do Anarchy Radio every week at kwvaradio.org. Tuesday evenings, it's recorded, it's archived. You can find it at my website, which is johnzerzan.net. So yeah, thanks for asking, Jason.
All right, great. Well, thank you again for being on the show. That was a great and provocative and disturbing conversation. I bet people will enjoy it a lot. Okay, take care. Thank you again. right. Hope you really enjoyed that episode. Check out our new course at magic.me, magick.me. It's called Why Magic? Start Here. And it is a free 25-minute introductory session with me about what magic is, how to learn it, and why you should. Pro tip, because everything is going off the rails. And it's a really, really, really good way to get control back over your life. All right, go check it out. I will see you in class, and I will see you next time.